Good morning, everyone. I'm Ronnie Ziggy, and I'm very happy to be introducing this morning's program. We welcome everyone, all races, all faith backgrounds, all ethnicities, all gender identities, orientations, and expressions, all those who suffer disabilities, and all political perspectives who come in peace. We begin our program today with the chalice lighting. We Unitarian Universalists don't drink from our chalice. Instead, we use it to hold the flame. The circle chalice helps keep the fire small. The flame doesn't blind us. It doesn't burn us. It gives us light so we can see all the different things in the universe, even the invisible ones, because the Unitarian Universalist flame is a light of learning. The flaming chalice is a symbol of learning and of love. It's our symbol of Unitarian Universalism, by Elizabeth Harding. Now, please join me in our affirmation of covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church, and the quest of truth its sacrament, service its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into the harmony of the good. Thus do we covenant with one another. Our tradition at UUVC is to be generous with time, talent, and treasures, so each week we take up a collection to show our commitment to ourselves and to the community at large. This month's Share the Plate recipient is Jackson House. This nonprofit service for emergencies and crisis intervention is designed to help clients utilize community resources, to provide clients with direct assistance whenever possible, and to follow up with supporting counseling. Jackson House is a vessel providing the place where community spirit comes together to provide for the needy men, women, and children of Garland County. We work in harmony with all faiths to be responsible stewards of our community resources. To make a contribution, send your check made out to UUVC to 403 Barcelona, Hot Springs Village, Arkansas, 71909, with share in the memo line.
Hello, I'm Salli Forbes, and I'm here with Diane Morton, and we are going to talk to you this morning about a recent trip we took to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabama, and to Memphis, Tennessee. It's called The Struggle for Civil Rights, Past and Future, A Journey of Inquiry and Compassion. And we feel that this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. really expresses what we have felt, what we have experienced. We know that there's a great deal of tension around civil rights today, and there is a great need for more justice. Diane?
And the purpose of the trip, I felt, was to try and learn, understand, and comprehend a little bit more what happened during the past 400 years regarding history of civil rights in order to understand what is happening today. A tall purpose.
We're going to talk to you about this trip in the order in which we took it. So we're starting with Wednesday, where we spent the day in Montgomery. And these are the things that we visited. The places we visited were part of the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI. We went to the Legacy Museum and the Peace and Justice Memorial Garden. Here we are in front of the Legacy Museum. Bryan Stevenson is one of the attorneys in a law firm that is in Montgomery, and it's the Equal Justice Initiative law firm. he has stated what the purpose of the Equal Justice Initiative actually is. It is very important to tell the truth about the slave trade, racial terror, and lynching, but also to tell the truth about what happened following the emancipation. Let me read a bit from their book about the purpose of the Equal Justice Initiative. It is a nonprofit law organization that has worked for more than 25 years to improve justice and fairness for the poor, disadvantaged, and incarcerated. It was founded in 1989 to provide legal assistance to men and women on Alabama's death row. EJI has represented the condemned, wrongfully convicted, unfairly sentenced, children in the criminal justice system, and the mentally ill and disabled facing imprisonment. They are actively working to end inhumane conditions of confinement, improve re-entry opportunities for the formerly incarcerated, and eliminate mass imprisonment, extreme punishments, and cruel sentencing practices. They further state their belief about committing to this effort and the honest reflection that is needed, and that there's no more time to lose. This is something we need to be all engaged in right now. Ida B. Wells was a Black woman who was a newspaper writer and publisher in the early 1900s. She also wrote a great deal about lynching in the South, brought it to a lot of people's attention, and later posthumously won a Pulitzer Prize. But I think that this quote really captures it. It's really important to put light on what has happened in the past. When we walked into the Legacy Museum, this is exactly what we saw on this brick wall. The Legacy Museum itself is an 11,000 square foot space located on the site of a warehouse that once confined enslaved Black people awaiting sale. It's a physical site and an outreach program. It's designed, the museum itself is designed as an engine for education about the legacy of racial inequality. It's important to understand why Montgomery is the location for the Equal Justice Initiative and particularly the Legacy Museum. It was a city that was shaped by slavery. And there's a chronology that led to having Montgomery become a central location for the slave trade. First of all, the areas that are now Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida were seized land from the Native Americans. And as people moved into those territories, they later became those states. What really changed slavery in the South were a couple of things. First of all, in the 1790s, the invention of the cotton gin, which actually the cotton gin would separate the seeds from the cotton, clean it, and could do it so much more efficiently and at such a lower price that it really increased the production. They needed a greater production of cotton. In fact, the South became the #1 producer of cotton in the world. And there were many, many people who made a great deal of money, all of whom were slave owners. Another thing that influenced that change was the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, which meant that they could no longer import slaves to the United States. That meant that any new slaves had to be the offspring of the slaves that were currently in the United States. And when there was this increased need for slave labor to pick the cotton, to be cleaned with the cotton gin and then sent abroad, there was a need to actually move slaves from the upper South to the lower South. And in fact, within a 50-year period of time between 1810 and 1860, approximately 1 million Black people were forcibly sold and moved to lower states, and Montgomery was one of the main slave trading centers. That meant that these people were torn from their families. They didn't send the whole family down there. They sent the strong men who could pick the cotton. And so it left a lot of anxiety, fear, and sadness among these families that were torn apart and the Black people who were put in those conditions. Montgomery became one of the slave trading centers because of its access to the Alabama River, which runs right through it, and because they extended the railroad to the center of Montgomery. And in fact, it was slave labor that built the railroad extension to Montgomery. That allowed them to ship a lot of slaves from the upper South to the lower South. By 1860, Alabama's population included 400,000 enslaved people. In Montgomery itself, 2 out of 3 residents were slaves. But slavery did not end with the abolition of slavery. It evolved. This is from W.B. Du Bois. That brief moment in the sun would be after emancipation and really Reconstruction. And it wasn't just totally a brief moment in the sun. And Diane will tell you more about that later, but it certainly was not free from terror and force and, really terrible things that happened. But there were promises of a future that would be brighter. The folks in the Equal Justice Initiative office have stood in countless courthouses with Confederate monuments on their front lawns and visited countless prisons where chained Black men labor in fields that were once plantations worked by enslaved people. They've watched politicians endorse increasingly punitive, tough-on-crime policies. From these observations, they've learned that slavery, racial terror, and Jim Crow segregation are still palpable in the American South and discernible in federal lawmaking and national rhetoric. One of the things that is particularly unique to the Legacy Museum is this shelf on both sides of glass bottles that contain the earth from spots, location sites where lynchings took place. And it's all based on the really good scholarship and study of locations and identifying who was actually lynched. When we looked at these, we were looking for Arkansas to see if there were some there. And there were 2 sections that really stuck out for us. One was 12 different bottles, 12 people who were lynched in Elaine, Arkansas between October 1st through the 7th of 1919, one of whom was a woman. Another section were 9 people who were lynched in Marianna, Arkansas on September 29th, 1891. All of them are unknown. In fact, there are 492 documented lynchings that occurred in Arkansas between 1877 and 1950. 5 in Pulaski County, 3 in Garland County. There were 245 alone in Phillips County, which is over on the eastern side. And there is a map in the museum that shows how many were lynched in each county.
This is the Equal Justice National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also called the Memorial Garden. It is the nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. It is the manifestation of years of work by the Equal Justice Initiative to identify more than 4,000 African American men, women, and children who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. Here you will see 800 steel monuments, one for each county in the U.S., where documented racial terror lynchings took place. It is a sacred space for truth-telling and reflection about the terrible atrocities of racial terror. This was one of the monuments that was located that showed realistically what they were put through. The Legacy Pavilion is something that is just being worked on right now. It is not actually open. This is a beautiful site, but it's very sobering. And these are some of the monuments that you will see that talk about the people that were lynched actually in the day they were killed in Arkansas. In Garland County, there was 3. This was, after seeing this photo of Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith on August 7th, 1930, Abel Maripol was inspired to write the poem Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit originated as a poem written by Abel Maripol under his pseudonym Lewis Allen as a protest against the lynchings. In the poem, Maripol expressed his horror at lynchings, inspired by Lawrence Beetler's photograph of these 2 young men that were lynched in Marion, Indiana. Maripol published the poem under the title Bitter Fruit in January 1937 in the New York Teacher, a unionized magazine of the Teachers Union. Maripol had asked others, notably Earl Robinson, to set his poems to music, he set French Strange Fruit to music himself. First performed by Maripol's wife and their friends in social contexts, his protest song gained a certain success in and around New York. Maripol, his wife, and the Black vocalist Laura Duncan performed it at Madison Square Garden. Billie Holiday approached her recording label, Columbia, about the song, but the company feared reaction by record retailers in the South, as well as negative reaction from affiliates of the co-owned radio network CBS. When Holiday's producer John Hammond also refused to record it, she turned to her friend Milt Gabler, owner of the Commodore label. Holiday sang Strange Fruit for him a cappella and moved him to tears. Columbia gave Holiday a 1-session release from her contract so she could record it. The song was highly regarded. The 1939 recording eventually sold 1 million copies, in time becoming Holiday's biggest selling recording. The words, you can hear it sung in a movie that is just recently released called U.S. versus Billie Holiday. And it is a very, very moving song to listen to her sing it. So if you can watch this movie, you will understand. The words even will be hard to read.
This is one of the statues or in that garden that really demonstrates Black people rising up. On Thursday morning, we headed for Selma, and we spent all morning and part of the afternoon there. We went first to the Selma Interpretive Center, which is a national park. We crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, visited Selma Voting Rights Memorial Park, the Ground Chapel AME Church, and the George Washington Carver Homes Project, which surrounds it, and then the Live Oak Cemetery. This comes from the Interpretive Center, and I think it's really important to capture the fact that the segregation had to do with the political power of the ballot box, something that we are still dealing with today. I'm going to take you a little bit through the chronology that led up to the Selma to Montgomery March, and Diane will talk about the march itself. In 1933, the Dallas County Voters League was founded to work with Black Americans and to register them to vote. A few decades later, in 1964, they still had not made a lot of progress, although there were more Black citizens who were able to vote. It was still a very, very small percentage. And in 1964, Judge James Hare issued an injunction, and that injunction did not allow for Black people to congregate in groups larger than 3 persons. Now think about that. If you had a family and you had 2 children, automatically you have broken the law. The one exception were churches, where they knew that people needed to congregate in order to worship. That Dallas County Voters League, and by the way, Dallas County is where Selma is located, continued to meet even after the injunction, but they had to do it in secret at that point. In 1963, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, came to Dallas County, to try to help with the organizing and to challenge the barriers to voter registration with a nonviolent means. This is one of the pins that those SNCC volunteers would wear. In December of '64, the Dallas County Voters League reached out to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and in particular, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and to help them with that movement, with the voter registration movement. And things happened pretty quickly after that. In December of 1964, or excuse me, in January of 1965, after that December, the next month, Dr. King started his work in Selma with a rally and a march. Other marches were held in February, and they led to mass arrests and police brutality. In fact, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was an Army veteran, a young man, was killed by a state trooper while demonstrating for voting rights.
Oh, and here we are at the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge. Ironically, this bridge, a powerful symbol for voting rights, is named for a Confederate general and a Ku Klux Klan leader, which he was called the Grand Dragon. And some people have argued that the bridge should be changed to House Representative John Lewis, but others surmise that a landmark representing Black triumph over white supremacy suits the bridge well. There were a total of 3 marches across this bridge. The first one was Bloody Sunday on March 7th, when the march led by John Lewis were met at the foot of the bridge by violence from a sea of blue Alabama state troopers blocking the highway. They were beaten, and then when they did turn around, the state troopers continued to follow and attack them on the streets of Selma. On March 9th, approximately 2,000 marchers approached the state troopers, which were still at the foot of the bridge, and then kneeled and prayed, and then turned around. due to an injunction that had been placed on the march. That night, a clergyman who had marched, Reverend James Reeb, was attacked on a Selma street and later died. In his eulogy, Dr. King said, "Again, we must ask the question, why must good men die for doing good?"
Following that second march, a couple of important things happened. On March 15th, President Johnson called on Congress to pass a voting rights bill. On March 17th, Judge Johnson lifted the injunction against the march in Selma, which would allow another march to take place. And then on March 20th, President Johnson federalized 1,900 Alabama National Guard troops and sent 2,000 soldiers and dozens of FBI agents to support and protect the marchers.
Then on March 21st was the third march, when some 4,000 marchers set out from Selma, headed to the Capitol in Montgomery. But when they reached Highway 80, the march was restricted to only 300 due to the size of the road. Most of this core group marched all the 54 miles, stopping at 4 campsites along the way where they were fed and rested. As they approached the Capitol, the numbers rose to a jubilant 25,000. Tragedy struck again that evening when Viola Liuzzo, who had come from Detroit to help drive the marchers back to Selma, was shot by a member of the Ku Klux Klan while driving her car. On August 6th, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which suspended literacy tests, called for the appointment of federal election monitors, and directed the U.S. Attorney General to challenge the use of poll taxes by states. And then we went to the Selma Voting Rights Memorial Park, which was based at the foot of the bridge off to the left if you were coming from Selma. And this is a small park located at the foot of the bridge where Bloody Sunday took place. And this is a commemorative sign that was placed there regarding the lynchings by the Equal Justice Initiative. There is another marker that reads, "Never forget, never again," which explains how the bridge, named for a Klan leader, should encourage individuals to cherish the right to vote. There are also several monuments, one for John Lewis and another for Amelia Boynton Robinson, who was the matriarch of voting rights. Her home was a planning site for the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March. Amelia was among the protesters on the bridge on Bloody Sunday, was hospitalized, but lived to the ripe old age of 104. She just died in 2015.
The Selma Brown Chapel AME Church is surrounded by that George Washington Carver Homes project. And many of the people who were marchers who were from Selma lived in that Homes project. It's important to remember that there was this injunction that did not allow for more than 3 Black people to congregate anywhere in public except in churches. So both of these sites were very important in the planning of the marches and of the movement of all the demonstrations. In the George Washington Carver project, which actually dates back to 1952, many of the leaders from Selma lived there, and Dr. King actually stayed with them when he was in Selma. He did a lot of the initial planning there because people could come together in homes. And then in the church later would be the larger group meetings to get people ready to do the marching, do the protesting. One thing that's really important to note is that at the end of Bloody Sunday, after the beating occurred, people rushed back to the church, and that's where a lot of them were nursed and cared for.
Then we went to the Live Oak Cemetery in Selma, which is a beautiful park cemetery with live oaks hanging with moss, and many colorful azaleas were in full bloom, but with an ugly history. It is a historic city-owned cemetery, a burial site of several Confederate who died in the Civil War. Also buried there is General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is the Ku Klux Klan founder and who built his fortune selling Black people into slavery. And also there is a picture of the flag. The Confederate flag is flying there along with the Alabama state flag.
And this is the Alabama Confederate state flag.
Then we returned to Montgomery for a virtual tour of the Rosa Parks Museum because it was closed due to COVID. But we had a one-on-one tour. This was Rosa Parks was a department store seamstress who refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white passenger and was arrested for quietly asserting her rights on December 1st, 1955. She wasn't sitting in the white section. It was crowded and the white passengers pushed into the black area where Rosa Parks sat. The Montgomery bus boycott was the turning point in the American Civil Rights Movement. It lasted for 381 days. This plaque and museum are located on the spot where Rosa was arrested. There is also a restored station wagon in this museum that was used to transport residents to their workplaces. Often preachers drove these vehicles, and the cars came to be known as rolling churches to boycott the buses. The buses were losing $3,000 a day. Martin Luther King, leader of the Montgomery Improvement Project, laid out demands for the changes on the buses. The three demands were: 1, to be treated fairly; 2, first come to the bus stop, first to get on; and the third one was to have Black drivers and stops in Black neighborhoods. And this was the sign outside of our hotel that basically said this was the first White House of the Confederacy was built. And this beautiful mural was painted on the side of a building that depicted the march from Selma to Montgomery.
On Friday, we headed for Birmingham. We visited the 16th Street Baptist Church on the outside, the Kelly Ingram Park, and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. The 16th Street Baptist Church was, we know it because of the bombing that occurred there, but it was also a center for planning strategy for the civil rights movement in Birmingham, where it was a very segregated city and they were trying to integrate as well as gain the right to vote. This particular photograph is very meaningful because you see the sculpture of young children in front and the church behind it. The sculpture is to really commemorate the 4 young girls who were killed on Sunday, September 15th, 1963, in a bombing. On that date, 4 members of a local Ku Klux Klan chapter planted 19 sticks of dynamite attached to a timing device beneath the steps located on the east side of the church where the girls were at that time. There were also between 14 and 22 other people who were injured. Although the FBI had concluded in 1965, just 2 years later, that the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing had been committed by 4 known Klansmen and segregationists. They were Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry. Although they've been identified, no prosecutions were conducted until 1977, when Robert Chambliss was tried and convicted of the first-degree murder of one of the victims, 11-year-old Carol Denise McNair. And a revival of effort by states and federal government to prosecute cold cases from the civil rights era, the state conducted trials in the early 21st century of Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. and Bobby Cherry, who were each convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in 2001 and 2002, respectively. Future United States Senator Doug Jones successfully prosecuted Blanton and Cherry. Herman Cash had died in 1994 and was never charged with his alleged involvement in the bombing. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing marked a turning point in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement and contributed to the support for passage of the by Congress of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 4 little girls who were killed in that bombing were Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, all of whom were 11 years old, and Cynthia Wesley, who was 14. Inside Kelly Ingram Park, there's a plaque that commemorates that bombing and the loss of those 4 little girls. The park is dedicated not only to that bombing and the loss of the children, but also to the Children's March. The Children's March actually had taken place earlier than the bombing itself. The Children's March was on May 2nd, 1963, and the bombing took place on September 15th. Quite honestly, the bombing probably was in response to the Children's March as well as some of the other things that took place. In the entry to Kelly Ingram Park, there is a statue of those 4 little girls. On May 2nd, 1963, more than 1,000 students skipped classes and gathered at 6th Street Baptist Church to march to downtown Birmingham, Alabama. As they approached police lines, hundreds were arrested and carried off to jail in paddy wagons and school buses. When hundreds more young people gathered the following day for another march, White Commissioner Bull Connor directed the local police and fire departments to use force to halt the demonstration. Images of children being blasted by high-pressure fire hoses, being clubbed by police officers, and being attacked by police dogs appeared on television and in newspapers and triggered outrage throughout the world. The photo on the left is of the statue of children crouching, and the one on the right is of a more distant view that shows the water cannon itself. And these statues show the brutality of the attacks with police dogs. Despite the violence, children continued to march and protest in an organizing action now known as the Children's Crusade. The crusade ended after intervention from the U.S. Department of Justice. The event moved President John F. Kennedy to express support for federal civil rights legislation and the eventual passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This is a sculpture of 3 Black ministers praying for the children.
Birmingham became known as Bombingham due to the violence inflicted on the segregationists. From 1945 to 1962, Birmingham witnessed 50 racially motivated bombings of African American homes, business, and churches. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is separated into 5 themed galleries. The first gallery depicts barriers, covers social norms before the movement kicked off when segregation seeped into every corner of life and afflicted everything from water fountains to barbershops. The second area was confrontation, which includes white Ku Klux Klan robes, an emblem of the misplaced power, fear, and violence. The third area was movement, displays the bus boycott, the original steel bars from the jail cell that held Martin Luther King for 11 days, and from where he wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail. The fourth area is the human rights, which discusses freedom movement and links the U.S. civil rights movement to the larger quest for equality and access. And the final area is resource, where you can listen to an oral history collection, including voices of foot soldiers who marched in the 1963 Children's Crusade. It was separate but not equal. There was 42.8 students per Black teacher to 24.3 students per white teacher, twice as many. And you can see here the difference in the classrooms, how modern the white classroom was compared to the classroom for the Blacks. And this is the separate drinking fountains. "73% of Black males worked as laborers in 1950, but only 33% of white males worked as laborers." Again, separate but not equal. And the Birmingham population over time shows that the percentage of Blacks grew from 1890 down to 1990. It increased sufficiently.
And yet they did not represent the voting population in the same way. The violence and terror really was systemic, and it was a part of the culture there. Although it was mostly addressed towards Black citizens, it also involved white citizens as well. Father James E. Coyle performed a marriage between a dark-skinned Puerto Rican man and a white woman, and the next day was shot and killed by the bride's father, who was the Reverend Edwin Stevenson. So it was just so, it permeated so much of the system. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was really one of the leaders of the Birmingham Black community. He wanted to enroll his children in a previously all-white school, the Phillips High School, and he tried in 1957 to enroll them, and he was beaten by a mob at that time. This particular quote from Martin Luther King Jr., I think really expresses the fact that there was a higher power than just the officials of Birmingham. James Lawson, Reverend James Lawson, was a very important person in the civil rights movement because he really brought the nonviolence to the movement itself. He was the guiding spirit of the student sit-in movement. He had studied Gandhi's philosophy in India and returned to America to teach the principles of nonviolence. In 1960, he was a divinity student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and he conducted workshops there and across the South in passive resistance. Diane Nash and John Lewis were two of his students, and they later became important leaders in the civil rights movement. Diane?
On Saturday, we went to the National Civil Rights Museum and the Lorraine Motel. This museum was a great recap of what we had already seen at other cities and sites, which was a nice way of ending our journey. It encompassed all of the major civil rights movements in the US. The highlight of this museum for me was the sanitation workers' strike, because this wasn't anything we had seen too much before. It began on February 1st, 1968, with the death of 2 Black sanitation workers who were crushed by a faulty garbage truck while seeking shelter from the rain. They had tried to strike before, but couldn't get support, but this tragedy started the strike. 2 weeks later, 1,300 workers walked off the job demanding better pay, treatment, and the right to unionize. King then arrived and spoke to 25,000 people on March 18, 1968. Racial tensions mounted, and a local teen was killed by a white cop, and Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th at the Lorraine Motel by James Earl Ray.
We would like to end this presentation and our sharing of our journey with a few questions that we think we all should consider. In terms of the public recognition of racial inequality, should we do more to publicly acknowledge our history of racial injustice? There are other parts of the world where this has occurred. In Germany, there are many different ways that they acknowledge their history of under the Nazis of genocide. And there are places in South Africa that do the same. We just simply don't have very many. In terms of memorials and monuments, most states have done nothing to acknowledge the history of slavery or to recognize that legacy of slavery. So why is that? What should be done about this? Police shootings of unarmed people, which we're very much aware of right now. How do we improve police and community relations and end unnecessary police violence? Wrongful convictions of innocent people. Most prosecutorial offices don't have a conviction integrity unit to help investigate and correct wrongful convictions. Should this change? And racial injustice in the church. The churches and people of faith have a special obligation to address the history of racial inequality. I want to thank you for joining us today and hope that you will join us in the conversation later this morning.